gosh, look at the crowd.
Come this way.
Those who spread goodness radiate happiness to everyone around them. Introducing LOLC Finance Credit Cards. Fuel the goodness in you.
Welcome to LMDtv. I'm Ashwini Vethakan. Joining us this week on Talking Business is naturalist and taxonomist Rohan Pethiyagoda. Welcome to the show, Rohan. It's good to have you with us.
Thank you.
Rohan, environmental destruction is usually cited as the cost of economic growth, which causes opposition for development projects. In your opinion, is development necessarily the enemy of the environment?
No, not at all. I think every country, every society has a desperate need to develop to some kind of optimum socioeconomic standard, which we see in the developed world today. And I don't see development by any means as the enemy of the environment. In fact, developed countries tend to have much better environmental standards than undeveloped countries. So I see development as a good thing, but we need to do development as best as we can with minimal harm to the environment. In my view, the bigger harm to the environment comes from poverty, because poor people have various disadvantages which make it difficult for them to be as environmentally compliant as we could be as citizens. Poverty is a big disabler in society. And so lifting people out of poverty, I think, is the biggest thing we have to do in order to have a better environment.
Why do developed economies have such high environmental standards? And what are the main factors that prevent developing countries from achieving the same?
It's tough because environmental compliance needs money. It's more expensive. It's more expensive to have a wind farm, for example, and electricity storage in batteries, electricity that comes from, for example, solar and wind power from renewables. Storage of power is extremely expensive. That's why, for example, in California, which is largely based on renewables, electricity is so expensive. We can't afford to pay those prices for electricity in countries like ours, which is why we use cheap options like coal. So environmental compliance costs money. And when people get to a certain level of affluence, I think they pay more attention to environment. When you're poor, when you're developing, it's much more difficult to do that. If you think about it, the difference between developed and developing countries is really unreal. Developed means that you've got to a certain place in life. It's like you're an adult. You've reached a certain stage in your process and you've stabilized. Developing means that things are changing year by year. No year is the same as the previous year. And you know this from Sri Lanka's own example. If you think of it in terms of kids, for example, developing countries are a bit like teenagers. They're growing fast, they're eating a lot, they're disorderly, they're untidy, and they're smelly. So I kid. But the thing is, developing countries have a different reality from developed countries. And that's something that we need to take into account when we plan environmental management activity. You can't apply the same standards to the two scenarios, though of course you have to try to be as compliant as possible.
Rohan, the Sri Lankan government recently announced that it would be the first country in the world to produce 100% organic agriculture. What are the consequences of this?
I don't know whether this is a program that's going to be sustainable. I'd be astonished if it was. I think it's going to be a massive failure, and either this government or a future government will backtrack on it because it simply can't be done. You have to bear in mind that we have 1 million rice farmers in Sri Lanka. I'll just take two sectors, right? We're not going to count vegetables and rubber and oil palm and all the rest of it, and coconut. Two sectors, rice and tea. 1 million rice farmers, 400,000 tea smallholders. Now, those 400,000 tea smallholders have to become compliant with the organic system. Now, let me just quickly tell you what this involves. Organic agriculture has much lower yields than conventional agriculture. Everybody accepts that. That's why they have conventional agriculture, because it yields more. So typically 30% more tea leaves will be produced by conventional agriculture than organic. So you take a loss when you shift to organic, however well you do the organic. That's part of the culture of organics. Now, the problem is, when you take that loss in production, you have to make up for it by getting a premium price for it, by getting an organic certified label. Now, assuming there is world market demand for the 300 million kilos of organic tea that Sri Lanka is planning to produce every year, which I doubt. Then you have to get each of those 400,000 smallholders certified. This means that each of those smallholders, and remember, many of these people are living at the edge of poverty. They're not the best educated. They're not the people who got the most capital in this country. They're poor people, eking out a living, a subsistence existence from their tea smallholding of several perches. Now you tell them, here's the SLS standard, SLS 1324, which you have to now comply with. 85 pages of small print, most of it completely contrary to science, but let's leave that to one side. 85 pages of small print that they have to now comply with. In addition to that, they have to get an international organic certification, each of these 400,000 people. And that international organic certification is given by 7 multinational NGOs, so-called non-profit organizations that operate in Sri Lanka. 6 of them are European, 1's Australian. So this is the new colonialism. These people who come from overseas now dictate how we should do our agriculture. To get their certification, each one costs about $300 per year. 60,000 rupees from a smallholder is a lot of money. That's 2 months' income has to go to paying the certification fee to some foreign people who come here and issue the certificate from 400,000 people. Look at the cost of that. It's completely impractical. And if one of those people produces tea by cheating, by not doing it organically and gets caught, it affects the whole reputation of the Sri Lanka organic brand. So this is a program that really hasn't been thought out clearly by anyone. I have no idea whose brainchild it was, but it wasn't a clever idea. And I have no doubt that the government will backtrack on it. And it's not to say that there's any scientific underpinnings for this either. What's the problem you're trying to fix by introducing this organic system nationally? I don't see that. It's just absolutely bizarre as far as I'm concerned.
Rohan, CSR has become a crucial element of modern day business. So how can organizations leverage this to make a more significant impact?
That's a very good question. I think it's only the most profitable organizations that look at CSR. And many of them prefer to channel their CSR into social projects rather than environmental projects. So I know big corporates in Sri Lanka who do a lot of really good social work. Running old people's homes, running orphanages, giving money for education, poverty relief, and so on. So those are important things. For the environment, the only major initiative really has been Biodiversity Sri Lanka. This is a kind of NGO that is subscribed to by a large number of corporates in Sri Lanka, big and small, and they put money into this for projects like reforestation and so on. So I think for large companies to focus on environmental projects on their own is a waste of management time, because they have very skilled, very expensive management in many cases, but they also have large profits. So if they want to give money to a good cause that's doing valuable environmental service and also have a stake in managing entity, Biodiversity Sri Lanka, then I think that kind of initiative is the best way to go. But many corporates also try to do work on their own. Now, I think this is a bad year because the tea sector isn't making the usual profits that it does this year for various reasons. But the tea sector, if you take as an example, if you take the RPCs, the regional plantation companies, there's 18 of them, I believe, and they and the smallholders together manage about 350,000 hectares of land in Sri Lanka, in tea, rubber, oil palm, and coconut, and so on. Now, many of those plantations, if you think about our most valuable biodiversity centers like Singaraja, the Peak Wilderness, Horton Plains, and the Knuckles, they're surrounded by tea lands. They're little islands in the middle of this vast ocean of tea. And the RPCs are really well positioned in that framework, and they have the management capacity and the ability to administer really good environmental projects, for example, in forest conservation, sustainable forestry, and so on. And this is an opportunity we haven't explored sufficiently well in Sri Lanka. And I think it offers huge promise, but it means that the tea industry first has to be profitable, because if you don't have profits, you can't do anything.
And on that note, we'll be going in for a short break. Welcome back to the show as we continue our conversation with naturalist and taxonomist Rohan Pethiyagoda. What are the possible steps that can be taken to improve the community's attitude towards the environment?
Obviously, awareness is the thing that everyone would talk about. I think mostly in terms of education. If you think about it, already we have a society in Sri Lanka, people of Sri Lanka, who are infinitely more environmental conscious than they were when, at the time I was a kid, for example. In my lifetime, in the last 65 years, environmentalism has come from being the plaything of wealthy people in Colombo to something that is deeply entrenched in the consciousness of every young Sri Lankan person. And many factors played into this. In the 1990s, I helped to produce books, for example, on Sri Lankan birds, amphibians, reptiles, and trees, and so on, in Sinhala, so that for the first time, this technical scientific knowledge could be transferred in a Sinhala medium to our people. And those were hugely popular projects at the time, hugely popular publications. And it still gives me pleasure to go somewhere and see children bird watching, for example, reading a bird watching guide in Sinhala. So we made the hobbies of the wealthy, affluent people in Colombo the hobbies also of every ordinary Sri Lankan. And I think that bred a huge new awareness of environmental consciousness. Also, with the activism in cases like Singaraja, I think everyone saw that we had a treasure trove that was our joint heritage as a nation in terms of the biodiversity of this country, the environment and the landscape of this country, that we all want to cherish and preserve and hand on to our own children. So I think this is now deeply entrenched in the Sri Lankan people. I don't see a negative trend here. It's a very positive thing. What I would like to see environmentalism do is turn its attention more towards a scientific approach to its activity rather than a kind of ideological approach to it.
Coming back to ideologies, Rohan, in our pre-show chat, you mentioned that environmentalists' views are based on ideologies rather than science. Could you explain this statement?
Yeah, I will. Ideology, for example, is something like organic. Now, the organic, there's no science to show that organic food is any safer than normal food. But many people believe it is because that word organic has been associated with kind of greenism. So organic is an ideology. There's no scientific basis for doing it. It's a massively costly ideology to have. And there are many such ideologies that float around. For example, we have in the environmental movement a great dislike for nuclear energy, which is probably the cleanest and most sustainable medium-term energy provider for the whole world in terms of demand. But environmentalists have been opposed to this on the grounds of safety. I don't know, but nuclear energy kills very few people. Even in Fukushima, only one person died many years ago. 18,000 people died in the tsunami, but nobody thinks about the tsunami. They focus on the one person who got cancer. Nuclear energy is basically the safest form of energy we have. It's safer than coal, it's safer than oil in terms of deaths per year. And we're happy to have, for example, at Kundakulam in the southernmost tip of India, a 1 gigawatt nuclear power facility. Not very modern technology. By 2025, that's going to be 6 gigawatts. And Kundakulam is closer to Colombo than Jaffna is to Colombo. It's right next door to us. And we're not hysterical about having this plant in Kundakulam. Most people probably don't even know about it. But if we said we're going to set up a nuclear power plant in Sri Lanka, I can just see the outrage from the environmental movement. And this is probably one of the things that we'll need to do 10 or 15 years from now. But the environmentalists need to come to grips with these problems now, because if you're going to have a nuclear power plant, I'm not saying that we should, I'm just saying we might 20 years from now, you have to train a generation of nuclear physicists, maybe 50 or 100 nuclear physicists who are going to work in that, people with PhDs who are going to operate that, unless you want foreigners to come and run it for you. And to build the safety protocols, to get a site ready, to make sure that urban and suburban planning in that area is ready. So environmentalists need to actually engage with government and make sure that they get into the planning process rather than just objecting to things. Take genetically modified organisms, for example. Genetic engineering has been proven to be as safe as anything else. America has been eating genetically engineered food for the past generation, and no one's glowing in the dark as a result of it. But the whole ideology of environmentalism is opposed to it. Just like environmentalists don't fret at night about the 10,000 nuclear weapons that we have in the world, they'll fret about one nuclear power plant that is transparent and built around safety guidelines. Nuclear weapons, no one knows what's going on. We fret about things like genetic engineering, and we don't listen to the science. But if I were to come out and say, I don't believe that humans are responsible for climate change, every environmentalist will tell me, hang on a minute, but you're not listening to the science. The science says something different. But when it comes to nuclear energy or genetically engineered crops, for example, environmentalists are not interested in the science very often. And this is in an environment where most of our modern medicines, including the things we're getting jabbed at for COVID now, are genetically engineered. All the insulin in the world is today genetically engineered. So we're happy to have medicines that come from this technology, but not food. I don't see the logic there. So there's a lot of things mixed up in environmentalism, which are more driven by ideology than by science. And that's where I part ways with environmentalists, because I myself am a born and bred environmentalist, but I want to be a rational environmentalist. I don't want to be an ideological environmentalist.
Our final question for this evening, Rohan. What are your aspirations for the future of environmental management in Sri Lanka?
This is a time when everyone's economically stressed and environment isn't going to be on anyone's agenda for a while. That's a bad thing, because we should always be conscious of managing the environment as best as we can. However, looking to the future, I think the biggest bridge we have to build is between society, civil society, and government, where government starts trusting people to be good environmental actors. Up to now, we have looked at environmental management more from a perspective of regulation and policing. I want to see a Sri Lanka in which environmental management comes from us, the people, not because we are told to behave in a certain way, but because we want to behave in a certain way. And amongst young people now, you can see that already happening. The amount of litter, for example, on Sri Lanka's streets has dropped phenomenally in the last 20 years. And that's because young people have changed their behaviors. Smoking has fallen hugely, not just because of taxation, but because of more consciousness about the environment and about health. So people are moving in the right direction because they want to. The wrong reason to do it is because there's a law or a regulation that makes you conform. I think you need to be compliant to environmental norms because you are educated to do that. You're educated not to feel safe if you don't comply with environmental norms. And I think that's the direction in which we have to continue to go. So a greater amount of trust between government and civil society, I think, is what we need to build, where civil society actors can do the right thing without having to be shown a stick. And that's the direction I'd like to see us moving.
Well, this has definitely shed a lot of light on environmental management in Sri Lanka and, of course, the various issues that we are facing. So thank you for joining us on the show this evening, Rohan.
Thank you, Ashwini.
Coming up, we have the latest from Sri Lanka's economy. Stay tuned.
You love the feeling of being renewed. To stay beautiful every single day. To breathe just like we do, because you are truly delicate, protecting the ones who've been with us through the years. With Sayalac Care, the only wood coating that truly protects you. Sayalac Wood Coatings from JAT.
Welcome back to the show, and here's the latest from Sri Lanka's economy. Sentiments surrounding the economy continue to deteriorate in August, as a mere 6% of respondents to the LMD IQ Business Confidence Index or BCI survey say that economic conditions are likely to deteriorate in the next 12 months, declining from 10% in the previous month. In addition, the majority, 58% of survey participants, have a negative outlook and believe that conditions are likely to worsen in the coming 12 months, and another 36% say it will stay the same. As for long-term business prospects, the outlook has improved slightly with 60% versus 56% in the preceding month of the survey sample saying sales volumes will increase in the next 12 months. On the other hand, 11% of respondents anticipate a decline in sales during this period, while 29% say they will remain the same. When it comes to the short term, nearly a quarter of those surveyed point to an improvement in sales volumes over the next 3 months, while 22% believe they will decline. Sentiment related to the investment climate has also displayed signs of improvement, as 11%, up from 6% in July, of respondents describe conditions as good or better. Not surprisingly, however, the majority, 78%, do not consider this to be a good time to invest in the country. In terms of employment, the proportion of companies considering expanding their workforce in the next 6 months has increased to 12%, up from 10% in July. In contrast, 2% of those surveyed moot the possibility of retrenchment, while 86% say they will maintain their staff numbers. And that's all we have for you this week. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Thank you for watching and stay safe.